A 220-pound catch wrestler locked his massive arms around a man nearly 100 pounds lighter. The room held its breath, waiting for bones to snap. Instead, the giant screamed, violently ripping his hands away as if he'd grabbed a live power line. The smaller man, Bruce Lee. Oakland, California, 1964. The air inside the private martial arts studio was thick with the scent of canvas, chalk dust, and the heavy, metallic tang of unyielding egos. The mid-60s martial arts scene was a fractured landscape, deeply divided between rigid traditionalists who adhered to centuries-old katas and American brawlers who believed that sheer size and brute force were the ultimate equalizers in any physical confrontation. Bruce Lee, a 24-year-old provocateur with lightning in his fists and a philosophy that threatened to upend the entire establishment, stood at the epicenter of this cultural collision. Bruce was in the middle of a private demonstration outlining the early concepts that would eventually become Jeet Kune Do. He moved around the room with a predatory grace, his lithe, 135-pound frame snapping through motions that defied the naked eye. He was explaining the concept of interception, the idea that a fighter did not need to block and then strike, but could attack the attack itself. Watching from the back of the room, his massive arms crossed over a barrel chest, was Judson Harrison. Judson was a mountain of a man, standing 6'2" and weighing in at a rock-solid 220 pounds. He was a former collegiate wrestling standout who had seamlessly transitioned into the brutal underground circuit of catch-as-catch-can wrestling. He possessed the thick, corded neck of a bulldog, a set of cauliflower ears that served as trophies of 100 grueling mat wars, and hands that looked like scarred hams. To Judson, martial arts were nothing more than glorified gymnastics. He respected one thing: the inescapable, crushing reality of physics. Mass times acceleration, leverage. The undeniable truth of a heavy body imposing its will on a lighter one. Beside Bruce stood Jesse Glover, one of his earliest and most dedicated students. Jesse, a formidable judoka and boxer in his own right, knew the devastating power Bruce possessed, but even he felt a prickle of unease as he noticed Judson's sneering expression. The heavy tension in the room was palpable, a tightly coiled spring waiting to snap. "That's all very pretty, Bruce," Judson's voice boomed suddenly, cutting through the quiet focus of the room. The deep baritone echoed off the exposed brick walls. "It's fast, I'll give you that. It looked fantastic against a cooperative partner who's throwing a straight karate punch." Bruce paused. He didn't look annoyed. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile crept across his face. He turned to face the giant, his hands dropping casually to his sides. "Is there a question in there, Judson? Or are you just offering a critique of my choreography?" The room went dead silent. Other notable figures in attendance, including Ed Parker, a pioneer of American Kenpo who had an eye for authentic talent, shifted uncomfortably. Parker knew Bruce was exceptional, but he also knew the terrifying reality of a fully grown elite catch wrestler getting his hands on someone. It was the age-old debate, the striker versus the grappler. Judson uncrossed his arms and took 2 heavy steps forward. The floorboards visibly groaned under his weight. "No question. Just a statement of fact. You talk about being like water. You talk about flowing around an obstacle, but water doesn't flow when it's trapped under an anvil. If a man my size gets his hands on you, all that speed disappears. You can't punch your way out of a bear hug from a man who outweighs you by 90 pounds. It's physically impossible." "Impossible is a big word," Bruce replied, his voice dropping in volume, forcing everyone in the room to lean in to hear him. "You rely on your mass. You believe your weight is your absolute shield. But what happens when the very thing you rely on becomes the anchor that drags you down?" Judson laughed, a harsh barking sound. Words. Philosophy. It's all vapor, Bruce. In a real fight, I shoot in. I grab you, I take you to the floor, and I break you in half. You wouldn't have the space to generate a punch. Once I close the distance, your speed is utterly useless. Ow. Bruce tilted his head, his dark eyes locking onto Judson's. The playful demeanor evaporated, replaced by an intensity that was almost physical in its weight. Then why don't you show me? The challenge hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Jesse Glover took a half-step forward, his protective instinct kicking in. Bruce, there's no need to prove anything to him. This isn't a street fight. Bruce held up a single hand, silencing Jesse without looking away from the wrestler. It's an educational opportunity, Jesse, for all of us. He gestured toward the open center of the mat. Come on, Judson. No strikes to the face, no eye gouges, just you doing exactly what you said you would do. Pin me. Judson's eyes widened slightly, surprised that his bluff had been called, but the surprise quickly morphed into a predatory grin. He began unbuttoning his thick flannel shirt, tossing it aside to reveal a white undershirt that strained against the massive, sloping muscles of his shoulders and chest. You asked for this, Lee. Don't complain when something pops. The onlookers instinctively backed away, forming a wide circle. Ed Parker watched with narrowed eyes, his analytical mind trying to calculate the odds. On paper, it was a massacre. If Judson secured a grip, the fight was mathematically over. The sheer torque a 220-pound wrestler could generate would snap a 135-pound man's ribs or joints with horrifying ease. Bruce didn't bother to change. He stood in his slacks and the simple short-sleeved button-down shirt. He didn't bounce on his toes or drop into a traditional martial arts stance. He simply stood there entirely relaxed, his shoulders loose, looking as though he were waiting for a bus rather than preparing to fight a giant. Any time you're ready, Anvil, Bruce said quietly. The silence in the gymnasium was absolute. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Judson Harrison. The wrestler dropped into a low, crouched stance, his massive thighs coiling beneath him, his arms extended like the claws of a bear. He bounced slightly, finding his center of gravity. He wasn't going to play games. He wasn't going to throw a punch that Bruce could slip. He was going to employ the oldest, most brutal tactic in the grappler's playbook, the bull rush. He planned to absorb whatever strike Bruce threw, close the gap, and wrap his arms around the smaller man's waist and arms, neutralizing any offensive threat. Bruce remained perfectly still. His eyes, dark and unblinking, tracked the microscopic shifts in Judson's musculature. He was reading the kinetic telegraphing of the wrestler's intentions. Suddenly, Judson exploded forward. For a man of his immense size, the burst of speed was terrifying. He didn't just run, he launched himself, a 220-pound projectile aimed dead center at Bruce's torso. His head was tucked, his massive arms swinging wide to create an inescapable net of muscle and bone. Jesse Glover winced, fully expecting to hear the sickening thud of Bruce being driven into the hardwood beneath the thin mat. Bruce didn't retreat. That was the first twist. Against a heavier, rushing opponent, the instinct is to backpedal, to buy time and space. But Bruce understood that retreating against a larger mass only gave the mass momentum. Instead, he pivoted slightly, shifting his weight with agonizing precision. He stepped supplely off the center line, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. But Judson was an elite athlete. Seeing the subtle shift, the wrestler dynamically adjusted his trajectory mid-rush. It was a brilliant, chaotic adjustment. Instead of missing, Judson's sweeping right arm slammed heavily against Bruce's left side, and with a guttural roar, the giant clamped down. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Ed Parker leaned forward, his knuckles turning white. Judson had him, the wrestler's massive, calloused hand locked around Bruce's lower back, pulling the smaller man violently inward. His left arm snaked around, seeking to trap Bruce's arms against his sides in a crushing bear hug. The sheer force of the impact lifted Bruce an inch off the ground. For a fraction of a second, the traditional laws of physics reigned supreme. The anvil had landed on the water. Judson felt the triumph surge through his veins. He had closed the distance. He had the clinch. The fight in his mind was over. He braced his legs to pivot and execute a devastating belly-to-belly suplex that would drive the martial artist head first into the floor. "Gotcha," Judson hissed through gritted teeth, his muscles bulging as he initiated the squeeze. Then the world shattered. Bruce hadn't panicked. While suspended in the crushing grip of the giant, his face remained a mask of absolute, chilling serenity. He didn't try to muscle his way out. Trying to match strength with Judson would have been suicide. Instead, Bruce operated in the microseconds and the millimeters. As Judson squeezed, he inevitably tensed, locking his own joints and muscles into rigid pathways. Bruce felt the pressure, down the fulcrum of Judson's grip, and bypassed the muscle entirely. He targeted the nervous system, moving with a speed that defied the heavy drag of the grapple. Bruce's right hand whipped up in a space no larger than 6 inches. He didn't form a traditional fist. He extended his fingers rigid as steel spikes and drove his thumb side directly into the cluster of nerves located deep in the radial nerve pathway of Judson's wrapping forearm. Simultaneously, Bruce dropped his internal center of gravity, making himself feel impossibly heavy, a technique rooted in advanced internal martial arts. But it wasn't just a pinch. Bruce channeled the exact kinetic mechanics of his famous 1-inch punch, the sudden, explosive rotation of the hips, the snapping torque of the shoulder, and the violent contraction of the latissimus muscles, and channeled all of that devastating energy not into a punch, but into the localized manipulation of Judson's arm. He dug his reinforced thumb into the nerve bundle and twisted, applying a concussive shockwave directly into the grappler's nervous system. What happened next defied everything Judson Harrison believed about human physiology. It wasn't just pain. Pain was something a wrestler pushed through. Pain was a torn ligament or a busted lip. This was an electrical overload. A white-hot, searing agony shot up Judson's arm, bypassing his brain's logical centers and triggering an involuntary primal survival reflex. It felt exactly as if he had plunged his bare hands into a blast furnace. Aggh. The sound that tore from the giant's throat wasn't a roar of exertion. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated shock. Judson's brain commanded his muscles to hold on, to finish the slam, but his body violently rebelled. The muscles in his forearm spasmed uncontrollably, instantly losing all tensile strength. The massive arms that were supposed to break Bruce Lee in half recoiled with explosive speed. Judson physically threw himself backward, desperate to sever the connection with the smaller man. He stumbled, his boots catching on the edge of the canvas mat, and crashed heavily against the brick wall of the studio, clutching his right arm against his chest. His chest heaved, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and total bewilderment. He looked at his own hand as if he expected it to be charred black and smoking. The silence that followed was entirely different from the tension before the clash. This was the deafening silence of a paradigm shift. Bruce Lee stood exactly where he had been when Judson first grabbed him. His breathing hadn't changed. Not a single hair was out of place. He slowly lowered his right hand, the hand that had just dismantled a 220-pound monster in the blink of an eye. He looked across the room at the hyperventilating giant. "Water," Bruce said, his voice quiet, echoing softly in the stunned room. can flow, or it can crash. The heavy breathing of the spectators seemed incredibly loud in the aftermath of the impossible. Judson Harrison remained pinned against the exposed brick of the Oakland studio, staring at his right arm as if it belonged to a stranger. The thick, ropey muscles of his forearm were still visibly twitching, involuntary spasms rippling just beneath the surface of his skin. The terrifying white-hot agony had subsided into a deep, throbbing ache, but the psychological shockwave was still tearing through his foundation. He was a catch wrestler. His entire world was built on the undeniable laws of leverage, mass, and friction. In his reality, a man who weighed 135 pounds simply did not break the grip of a man who weighed 220. Yet, Bruce Lee had not only broken the grip, he had short-circuited Judson's entire central nervous system in a fraction of a second, using an economy of motion that defied rational explanation. Ed Parker, the father of American Kenpo, slowly let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stepped onto the mat, his eyes darting between the towering wrestler and the calm, relaxed martial artist. "Bruce," Parker said, his voice laced with a mixture of profound respect and intense clinical curiosity. "What in the hell was that? I saw the entry, I saw the shift in your center of gravity. But the release, it looked like he touched a live wire. You didn't strike him, not conventionally." Bruce turned toward Parker, a faint pedagogical smile touching the corners of his mouth. The dangerous intensity of the fighter had instantly vanished, replaced by the calm demeanor of a university professor. "It wasn't magic, Ed, and it certainly wasn't mystical chi. It was pure, unadulterated biology and physics, a problem of structural integrity." James Yim Lee, Bruce's close friend and assistant instructor in Oakland, chuckled softly from the corner of the room. He had felt the localized, devastating power of Bruce's nerve strikes in training. He knew exactly what Judson was experiencing. "He hit the off switch, Ed," James called out. Judson pushed himself off the wall, his face flushed with a complex cocktail of embarrassment, adrenaline, and genuine awe. He rolled his shoulder, wincing slightly as the lingering nerve pain flared. "You didn't overpower me," the giant rumbled, taking a cautious step back toward the center of the mat. "I had you. I felt the lock. But when you twisted, it felt like my bones were vibrating. My hand just let go. I didn't tell it to. It just quit. Because you left me the perfect circuit to overload," Bruce explained, pacing slowly, his hands resting lightly on his hips. "You think of the human body as a solid block of wood, Judson. You think if you wrap your arms around it and apply enough pressure, the wood will snap. But the human body isn't wood. It is a highly sensitive, interconnected electrical grid. Your muscles only fire because your brain sends a signal down your nerves. What happens if I interrupt that signal?" Bruce extended his own right arm, pointing to the thick bundle of nerves and tendons just below the elbow joint. "When you grabbed me, your forearm was flexed to its absolute maximum capacity. The muscles were taut, tight as piano wire. In doing so, you pulled the radial nerve tight against the bone, removing any natural shock absorption your tissue usually provides." The room listened in rapt silence. Even Jesse Glover, who had trained with Bruce for years, was leaning in. "I didn't try to pry your fingers open," Bruce continued. "That would be fighting your strength, which is foolish. Instead, I drove the rigid structure of my thumb knuckle directly into that exposed nerve bundle, and I applied the rotational torque of my entire body weight into a space of about 2 inches. I didn't fight your muscles. I bypassed them entirely and sent a concussive shockwave directly into your nervous system. Your brain received a pain signal so severe and sudden that it triggered a primal survival reflex. Your body forced your hand to open to escape the trauma. You didn't let go, Judson. Your biology let go to save your arm from what it perceived as catastrophic damage." The twist of the moment was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. The classic martial arts trope dictated that the defeated giant would fly into a blind rage, humiliated by the smaller man, and charge in for a sloppy, desperate second attack. But Judson Harrison was not a barroom brawler. He was an elite, disciplined athlete who obsessed over technique. The anger in Judson's eyes slowly dissolved, replaced by a burning, almost obsessive curiosity. The humiliation faded in the face of a technological leap he hadn't known existed. He looked at his massive hands, then back to Bruce. "That relied on the element of surprise," Judson stated, his baritone voice steady, analyzing the data. "I was rushing. My adrenaline was spiked. I was tense. If I know it's coming, if I don't give you that panicked tension, does it still work? Can you do it if I just slowly, methodically take you down?" A collective murmur rippled through the onlookers. Ed Parker crossed his arms, fascinated by the wrestler's analytical pivot. Bruce's smile widened. He loved nothing more than a skeptic willing to test a hypothesis. "You believe the rush was your downfall? You believe slow and methodical will save you? Very well, let's test the variable. Take your grip, Judson. Slowly this time. No strikes, just grapple." Judson didn't hesitate. He stepped back onto the center of the mat, shaking out his arms to dispel the remaining lactic acid and nerve shock. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. The bull rush was off the table. This time, he would employ the agonizing, grinding reality of Greco-Roman and catch wrestling. He would secure a collar tie, control the head, establish underhooks, and systematically dismantle the smaller man's balance before taking him to the mat. He approached Bruce with a low, wide base, his hands up and open. Bruce mirrored him, but his stance was entirely different. He stood in a relaxed, modified fencing stance, his right hand extended slightly forward, his body bladed to present the smallest possible target. He looked fluid, loose, and completely unbothered. Judson reached out slowly with his left hand, aiming to cup the back of Bruce's neck in a classic collar tie. This was the exact moment traditional strikers panicked, the closing of the distance. But Bruce didn't back away, nor did he rigidly block the incoming arm. He employed a core principle of Wing Chun that he was rapidly evolving into his own system, Tusao, or sticky hands. As Judson's thick wrist crossed into Bruce's defensive perimeter, Bruce's lead hand rose and lightly made contact. He didn't swat the arm away. He adhered to it. Like a magnetic connection, Bruce's forearm stuck to Judson's wrist. Judson frowned, pushing forward to secure the neck. But the resistance he met wasn't solid, it was dynamic. As Judson pushed forward with his massive shoulder, Bruce simply yielded, rolling his arm over the wrestler's wrist while simultaneously pivoting his hips. The heavy, methodical force Judson was applying suddenly found no resistance. It was like leaning heavily against a door only to have someone unexpectedly pull it open. Judson stumbled forward a fraction of an inch, his balance momentarily compromised. In that microscopic window of structural failure, Bruce struck. He didn't use a nerve strike this time. He used pure, unadulterated leverage and kinetic redirection. With his left hand, Bruce executed a flawless lopsala, grabbing hand, snapping his fingers around Judson's overextended right wrist. Simultaneously, Bruce's right hand shot forward, the heel of his palm crashing not into Judson's face, but into the hollow of his shoulder joint. Bruce pulled with the left hand and pushed violently with the right, applying a devastating shearing force across the wrestler's upper torso, while sweeping his right foot behind Judson's lead leg. The mechanics were so flawlessly executed that size ceased to matter. Judson's 220 pounds were no longer an asset. They were the very weight that condemned him. With a rushing sound of displaced air and the heavy, concussive thud that rattled the windows of the Oakland studio, The giant was airborne. He crashed onto the canvas mat flat on his back, the breath driven from his lungs in a sharp, explosive bar. Before Judson could even attempt to scramble or bridge, Bruce was there. He had dropped his weight perfectly alongside the fallen wrestler. Bruce's left shin was pinned painfully across Judson's bicep, trapping the arm, while Bruce's right hand hovered exactly 1 millimeter above the bridge of Judson's nose. Bruce's fingers were held in a rigid spear hand, vibrating with checked kinetic energy. "Dead," Bruce whispered softly, the word carrying clearly in the dead, silent room. Judson lay on the floor, staring cross-eyed at the spear hand hovering over his face. He didn't move. He couldn't move. His arm was immobilized by a shin that felt like an iron bar, and his brain calculated with terrifying clarity that if this had been a real fight, Bruce's fingers would have already penetrated his eye socket or crushed his throat. Slowly, Bruce withdrew his hand, stood up, and extended his hand to the fallen wrestler. Judson looked at the offered hand for a long moment. The ego of the catch wrestler, the pride of the heavyweights, the dogmatic belief that size was the ultimate arbiter of violence. All of it lay shattered on the canvas floor of the Oakland studio. He reached up, grasping Bruce's hand, and let the smaller man pull him effortlessly to his feet. "I didn't even feel you resist," Judson muttered, dusting off his slacks, his eyes wide with genuine revelation. "You weren't even there when I pushed. You just vanished, and then the floor came up to hit me." "That is the essence of what we are building here," Bruce said, turning to address the rest of the room, using the moment to crystallize his philosophy for Jesse Glover, James Yimley, and Ed Parker. The classical martial artist operates in rigid routines. The classical wrestler relies on overwhelming force. Both are limited by their adherence to a fixed system. But combat is alive, it is chaotic. If you rely on a rigid block, a heavier force will break it. If you rely solely on mass, a faster, adaptable force will redirect it. Bruce walked back to the center of the room, his voice rising with passionate conviction. "You must be formless, shapeless. Like water. When you pour water into a cup, it becomes the cup. When you pour water into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can drip, or it can crash." Judson tried to grab water. "You cannot grasp it, and if you try to strike it, it simply yields and swallows your fist." Ed Parker nodded slowly, a profound realization dawning on him. What he had just witnessed was not merely a neat trick or a specialized technique. It was a paradigm shift. Bruce Lee was not just bridging the gap between Eastern striking and Western grappling. He was completely dismantling the wall between them. He was proving that biomechanics, neuroanatomy, and physics were the universal languages of combat, transcending belts, styles, and weight classes. Judson Harrison walked over to the side of the room and picked up his heavy flannel shirt. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a man who had just discovered the earth was round after a lifetime of believing it was flat. He turned back to Bruce before walking out the door. "Mr. Lee," Judson said, the informal tone replaced by deep, earned respect. "If you ever need a heavy body to throw around to test those theories, you know where to find me." Bruce bowed slightly, a gesture of mutual warrior respect. "I'll keep that in mind, Judson. Keep flowing." As the heavy wooden door of the studio clicked shut behind the wrestler, the room erupted into hushed, excited conversation. The mythology of the untouchable grappler had been pierced not by a heavier grappler, but by a man who treated fighting not as a contest of strength, but as a chessboard of kinetic energy. The seeds of Jeet Kune Do, the chaotic, beautiful, and devastating reality of modern mixed martial arts, had just been watered on the blood and sweat-stained canvas of a tiny gym in Oakland. And Bruce Lee, standing quietly amidst the chatter, merely smiled, ready for the next challenge, the next anvil to crash against the water. Bruce Lee didn't just break boards, he broke the very foundation of traditional combat. What do you think about the striker versus grappler debate today? Did Bruce's philosophy pave the way for modern MMA? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this deep dive into martial arts history, hit that like button, share it with your training partners, and subscribe for more legendary, untold stories of the masters.